Welcome to the Alain Guillot podcast, a podcast about life, leadership, and money matters. Our guest today is Linda Hirshman. Linda is a cultural historian, a retired labor lawyer, and professor. She's an author specializing in revolutionary social movements. She has written 5 books, and today we will speak about her latest book, The Color of Abolition: How a Printer, a Prophet, and a Contessa Moved a Nation. Linda, thank you so much for joining us today.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me.
So, Linda, as I was reading about you, I am so surprised about the amount of social issues that you have confronted as an attorney, as a professor, as an author. I wonder if we could start by you telling us a little bit about your background. It feels like you have been around fighting for the good cause for many years. So let us know a little bit about you.
So after I got out of law school, I went to work for a big corporate law firm. And I figured out relatively quickly that it isn't that hard to represent rich and powerful people trying to become richer and more powerful. It seemed to me to be unworthy of me. This is not a hard game. Why is winning this game considered an achievement? So I left the firm and went to work for a union side labor law firm so I could represent working men and women who were less powerful than the forces they confronted. And as the years went by, of course, and America got more and more conservative, the unequal forces got greater and greater. So I did that for, the unions took a terrible hit and began to diminish in membership and influence. And the employers figured out that they could fight the unions, and they were particularly skillful in co-opting the government to help them in that fight. So it got to be a harder and harder battle. And I fought it for 15 years. And then when Reagan was elected, I thought, well, I'll go teach law school for a couple of years. This is so conservative, it can't possibly last. And before I knew it, we were in our third Republican term, and it was 1988. So at that point, I'm like, oh my God, I'm going to be in the academy for the rest of my life. I better get a PhD. So I went back to school and got a PhD. And on top of my law degree, I got a PhD in philosophy. And I focused my studies on the work of Thomas Hobbes. Thomas Hobbes, the great Enlightenment philosopher, focused mostly on how is it possible for people to act collectively to form the state, right? That was his problem. He had many other things that he considered, and he was a genius, but that's the most important work he did. So that interested me. How do people overcome the forces that pulled them apart to act collectively? I had been a union side lawyer all those years, and I know how hard it is to establish and maintain collective action. So I wrote my dissertation about Hobbes, and then I got hired to teach philosophy at Brandeis, and I did that. And then when I finished teaching college, even while I was teaching, I was writing, because that's what professors do. So I started writing. I was a feminist. The feminist movement had shaped my life in many ways. So I wrote about feminism. And then I just turned the frame of my studies of Thomas Hobbes and my experience with collective action in the world to other movements. And I was like, well, where else is interesting collective action going on? And I had been paying attention to it. I mean, I'm an educated woman. I read the paper and stuff. So I'd been paying attention to my own society. And I had been sort of following the gay movement for a while. I was interested in the gay movement because they made a moral argument. And that was very potent in the relativist American culture. So if everybody is saying everybody floats your boat, and you come in and say, this is actually a better way to live, then you have a big advantage. And I was interested in that. So my next book was about them. And then I just kept, seeing things that I thought would be interesting to write about. The book that we're talking about, The Color of Abolition, is the first book I've ever written that is entirely set in the past. So I didn't have anyone to interview, which is sort of too bad because I would have liked to have interviewed them.
Yes, that would have been nice to interview Frederick Douglass
No,
for
that would
one
be
person. But let me ask you, I'm curious about the source of your values. A lot of people go into law because they do want to defend the big and powerful, and they want to rub shoulder about and go to dinner parties. And you were not interested in this, so how come? Where does that value? Where those values come from? Why were you different?
I think I was really lucky. I had, when I was in junior high, middle school, they call it now, I had really liberal teachers. There's a reason why the conservatives are going after the public schools. The public schools are very potent vehicles for the communication of values. And I had two very wonderful social studies teachers when I was a little, like 13 or 14. And they sort of explained how the world is organized. And as I observed the world, I was already reading the local paper and stuff. I saw that their explanation fit the facts, was coherent. So I had no reason to doubt it. And I always kind of go where the facts lead, right? So once you see the world as structured in a way that favors the powerful, the wealthy, the white, the male, the Christian, and so forth, and you see that frame, you apply that frame to the world, and you see that it holds up pretty well, then you sort of have two choices. You can be part of the existing hierarchy. And there are people who do that, and I'm not saying that they're villains. Or you can seek a different arrangement. And I was drawn to seek a different arrangement. But some of this is just ego. I am completely obnoxious. And I really feel like I came to this life with a lot of advantages. And it was not worthy of me to waste them on people who didn't really need me. I wanted to use my talents for people who needed me.
Okay, that's lovely, and that's part of. I guess I was reading about you, and you mentioned that women who have high marketable skills should stay in the labor force for as long as they can to give to be a role model for other women, and because they can help better society like that, like you have done.
And also for themselves, they use their capacities. So I have been blessed. It is certainly possible that the world would have been organized in such a way that a woman, a Jewish woman like me, would not have been able to use her capacities. But I was lucky. I was born in America. There was a time of peace and prosperity, which now looks increasingly unlikely. And so I was able to use my capacities. So I know what it feels like. And I do think that, obviously the care of children is a human responsibility. But when I saw that it was entirely assigned to one gender, I became suspicious. And so my feeling is that responsibility, some of which is extremely interesting and some of which is extremely tedious, should be distributed more equally among the people, among the adults.
Right. If I may ask you a question, since you also work defending unions, I wonder, and there has been a big erosion of unions in the United States for many decades already. I wonder, how do you see unions in the face of globalization? I mean, is it possible
Very
to?
hard.
Okay.
It's very hard. Of course it's hard. I mean, when you're competing with societies that pay their workers 12 cents an hour, it's very hard. to protect your workers. I have observed that the countries of Western Europe and Canada, for example, do a better job of protecting their workers from the chill winds of globalization than the United States does. And that unions did not disappear from the society in France or Germany. I have observed this. And from this, I have concluded that it is not a law of nature like gravity or the rotation of the earth. There are ways in which people as a society can organize themselves so that the people who work in that society, the employees, have living wages and healthcare and decent working conditions, even in the face of globalization.
Right. Okay. So then another one of the topics that you have covered is the gay movement. And part of your argument is that the gay movement have a moral argument, but that is exactly the same sentence that many conservatives will use against the gay movement. So can you give us a little bit of a deeper explanation on that? How is the moral argument used to give rise to the gay movement, to gays, when that's the same sentence that the conservative movement use?
So the question is, where do the conservatives get their moral argument from? And the answer to that is they get their moral argument from revealed religion. There is no secular moral argument against gay identity or relationships. It's, if you press on it even a little bit, okay, you get a religious, ultimately a Roman Catholic argument, okay, or an Abrahamic religion argument, right? So I do not think that morality collapses into revelation. I don't think that revealed religion has a monopoly on morality. There are many other sources of morality. For example, the Greeks, right? We just talked about using your capacities. That's an Aristotelian theory of a moral life, a good human life. And so if you apply the standards of secular philosophy to the question of whether gay identity and relationships are moral, do they help the people to realize their capacities for loving relationships? Do they do more good than harm? Is there more pleasure than pain for people to have their human sexuality fulfilled rather than thwarted? Do they allow people enough freedom to treat them as fully autonomous human beings, like Kant says? So, if you think about secular values, then the moral argument for the gay revolution was patent, was obvious. And so what happened was the revelation-based moralists went after the gays and went after women trying to have sexual freedom and divorce and emancipation. So revelation-based morality was used in a lot of ways that were repressive. And the response of most Americans was, whatever floats your boat. Okay, you say moral, I say we don't care if it's moral or not. We call that relativism in my philosophy business. If you meet a moral argument with relativism, you're likely to lose. People respond more potently to arguments from the good than they do to arguments from relativism. Right? Even Vladimir Putin, who really is not my first choice person in terms of a moral avatar, is making a moral argument. The Russian people, the historical, right? He's making a sort of a Nietzschean argument, the Volk. But he's not saying whatever floats your boat. He's not even saying what Nietzsche said, right? Which is might makes right, although he's sort of saying that. But he's not willing to come out and just say, I have more soldiers than you do, so I'm going, right? He's not saying that. He's saying the Russian people, they're being abused. He's making moral argument.
Right.
So, okay. So, I mean, moral arguments are more potent And I was interested, and I'm actually a philosopher. So, and because I'm a philosopher, I'm trained in Western secular philosophy. I don't think that revealed religion has a monopoly on moral argument, right? I've spent a lot of my life in the other camp. So, so I was just interested that the gays were making these very potent moral arguments about the value of love, the value of human connection, right? The value of stable long-term relationships that are legally buttressed. These are very moralistic arguments, and they were doing pretty well. In fact, even in the current, shall we say, downturn in American politics, the gay movement, of all the movements that I've followed, is hanging on.
And it's hanging out quite well. Okay, so then let's move to the topic of this book, The Color of Abolition. What is it that inspired you to, first of all, there's a lot of research involved here, and this is the first book that you cannot interview a person. You couldn't interview Frederick Douglass, too bad for you. So what was the inspiration?
So I have, if you're interested in collective action and you're interested in American social movements, abolition is by far the most important social movement in American history. So I've always been interested in it. I was just a little intimidated at getting outside my wheelhouse, you know. When I write my books and I interview the people, I apply my philosophical understanding to it, and I'm well within my comfort zone. But getting into the archives and stuff was a little bit of a trip for me. So I was a little nervous about it, but I didn't want to finish my career without addressing it, because it's the most important social movement in American history. So I thought, well, how could I get into it in a way that would be accessible to my readers and interesting? And I read somewhere that William Lloyd Garrison, who was a printer, had set the type for Frederick Douglass's first memoir, a narrative of the life of Frederick Douglass. It had been Garrison who printed the book. And I thought, oh, what an intimate relationship. And I knew that there had been a breakup, right? Because I mean, I'm an educated woman. I know the basic history, 19th century history. And I was raised in the North, so I did not have the Gone with the Wind version of the Civil War taught to me. So, so I knew there had been a breach. And I thought, isn't this interesting? It was so intimate, and then there was a breach. I bet it was really hard to maintain an alliance across racial lines. I wonder if race played a role. And I started reading the secondary literature and found that indeed it had played a role. And since we're now looking right now, so I thought that would be so interesting to see how necessary it was. The slaves were not going to be able to emancipate themselves, and yet how difficult it was. And then as I was nosing around in the literature, I found my third character, Maria Weston Chapman, and I started reading her letters, and I found that there had been this very racist undercurrent in the movement to abolish slavery. And I thought that made it so much more interesting, right? And also she's a woman, so she was overlooked, of course, and she was a very Tony social class. So there was the issues of class in the movement that I thought, well, you know, this movement had a lot of interesting stuff in it. So then there was the pandemic, so I had nothing to do. So since I had nothing to do for 2 years, I just read the letters until my eyes bugged out. And I had nothing else to do. So I would sit with them for hours while I tried to decipher their illegible handwriting. And it was so interesting that I wrote the book. And it got a really great review.
Yes, we will speak about that in a second, but you mentioned already twice that you have been educated in the North. So I wonder how different is education in the North versus the Black in regards to Black history?
I would say that I was unbelievably fortunate. I had a great public school, and I had these liberal social studies professors, and they introduced me to the subject of race relations when I was very young. The first thing I ever wrote that was published was a letter to the editor of the Cleveland Plain Dealer in the northern city where I was raised, scolding them because they had characterized the Kenyan anti-colonial leader, Jomo Kenyatta, as a terrorist. And I had learned from my liberal teachers that he was, well, one man's freedom fighter, right? And so I wrote a letter to the local paper. So I was aware of the racial issues in my world from a very early age. My friends who are also educated in the North do not share my happy story, but I went to Cornell University in the 60s. And in the 60s, Cornell University had some of the greatest liberal intellectuals that America has ever known. We had David Bryan Davis, the father of modern abolitionist and slavery history. He was my teacher before he went to Yale. And so I just gave money to this center at Yale in his memory. And so, you know, maybe I just had a blessed life. But, you know, after Brown v. Board in 1954, it was there for people to learn if they were open. It was on television every night, and the civil rights marches, starting with the sit-ins in 62 at the lunch counters, right? And my parents were very serious about politics. And so it was, I don't think you can come of age in America in the 20th century and say, we had no way of knowing. There were ways of knowing, even if you weren't lucky enough to have my wonderful junior high school teachers and then David B. Davis at Cornell and Andrew Hacker. I mean, I had incredible teachers.
Well, I mean, good for you. You had incredible teachers, but I wonder what's your opinion of states like Texas and Oklahoma who are making it illegal to teach kids about Black history. They are forbidden to teach any kind of education that may hurt the feelings of white kids.
So the old Confederacy, remember I just wrote a book about the 1830s and 40s. When the abolitionists sent abolitionist pamphlets through the United States mail to be distributed through the South, the postmaster in, I think it was Savannah, set them aside and a mob came and burned them. And they asked Andrew Jackson to tell his postmaster general, which he did, to shut the post offices to abolitionist literature from the North. Wow. It was the Southern congressman who generated the gag rule in the United States House of Representatives so that petitions against slavery could not be delivered to the representatives who governed Americans. So this behavior goes back a long way. They want to have an autarky in the South and in the white parts of the North that imitate the South now, in which they will do exactly what the enslavers did in the 1830s. Burn the mail, close the post offices. They put a price on William Lloyd Garrison's head, gag the congressman, in clear violation of the right to petition in the Constitution. Okay, they want to do that. This is not unfamiliar behavior to me. And they will impoverish the places that they control. They will render them stupid. You were talking about globalization in a time when knowledge-based economics is critical to any kind of prosperity. They will render them stupid. And I will say what someone said about the Civil War. They said, when farmers go to war with engineers, the farmers lose. So it is familiar to me. It is deep rooted in the Southern culture, which is in turn deep rooted in the history of enslavement, the mortal sin of the American Republic. And if we can somehow survive the next election and the election of 2024, they will lose.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so now I believe every American knows something about Frederick Douglass. He was an amazing speaker. He was a kind of the torch of the abolitionist movement. Uh, but very few of us know anything at all about Maria Weston Chapman and William Lloyd Garrison. Can you tell us a little bit? First of all, can you just, to refresh our memory, tell us a little bit about Frederick Douglass to start off with? We know how talented he was, but just refresh our memory a little bit.
So let me start with Garrison, actually.
Okay.
People should know about Garrison. He was the father of the modern white abolitionist movement. There were Black movements for abolition, of course, and to resist slavery since somebody thought it up. Let's call it 1619, just to pluck a date from the ether. Since somebody thought it up, there have been Black resistance. But, Black people were sufficiently disempowered in America so that there was no way they were going to be able to emancipate themselves, and it's wrong to expect it. William Lloyd Garrison, there had to be an alliance. William Lloyd Garrison is the father of the alliance, and he began publishing the Liberator newspaper in 1831, which was the first modern alliance-based interracial abolitionist publication. And he also founded the first interracial anti-slavery society, the New England Anti-Slavery Society. So Garrison started, and he was in the abolition business for about 10 years when Frederick Douglass, enslaved since birth, got his chance to escape. He had been moved from the slave plantation where he was born and in his early childhood to Baltimore to be a companion for and then a household slave to his owner's family who lived in Baltimore. And while he was in Baltimore, they were city people. They were not accustomed to having slaves. They didn't really know what to do with him, so they lent him out, and he earned money, and he had to give them all the money he earned. And he met there was a large free Black community in Baltimore. He met his future wife, Anna Murray Douglass, there, and he decided, he made his third try to escape. Frederick Douglass was always trying to escape. And he got the papers of a Black sailor. There were free Black sailors, and when they would go into slave territory, they would be in danger of being thrown into slavery. So they had papers to show that they weren't slaves, and they lent them out. There's a very robust Underground Railroad subtext to Frederick Douglass's escape. Okay, so people helped him. He just didn't write about it because he didn't want to blow the gaff, which is right. It was the right decision, as most of his decisions were the right decision. Anyway, he gets the papers. Anna Murray makes him an outfit that looks vaguely nautical, and he takes his life in his hands and gets on a train. And this time he makes it to New York. And he says he breathed his first air of freedom in New York City. And many people have felt that way about New York over the centuries. And the Underground Railroad gathered him up, David Ruggles gathered him up, and sent him to New Bedford, Massachusetts, because the good people of New Bedford didn't like the slave catchers, and they kind of kept their eye out for their enslaved people. So the slave catchers couldn't come and drag them back into the gulag. And somebody heard Frederick Douglass talking about his experience in slavery at his Black church in New Bedford, and took him to Nantucket, where he met William Lloyd Garrison and became part of the American abolitionist movement. And they hired him on the spot, and they sent him out to speak for them. And he was a leading light of the abolitionist movement ever after. In the time that he was a part of the Boston branch of abolition, his labors were managed by Maria Weston Chapman. Maria Weston Chapman had volunteered for Abolition in 1834, 7 years before Douglass appears. And she was staggeringly talented and energetic. So she rose quickly to kind of run the show. So she became the corresponding secretary of the Female Anti-Slavery Society. She got on the executive committee of the New England Anti-Slavery Society, and she gathered the strands of the movement into her hands. They called her the Contessa. Her enemies called her Lady Macbeth. There's no question that she mattered. How she managed to be overlooked all these years, I don't know, but there she was lying in wait. There's a little book about her family, the Western Sisters by another feminist historian. And I stumbled across it and thought it would be better to tell the story of her huge role in abolition. She was a snob. Many of the Boston abolitionists were Brahmin snobs. And it emerged as the years went by that she thought that Frederick Douglass thought he was better than he ought to be. And the two of them clashed, and eventually there was a breach. And Douglass went over to the New York branch of abolition, which was brilliant, because that was the moment when the New Yorkers decided they would start down the road of forming the Republican Party. And the next thing you know, you're at Fort Sumter.
Amazing story. I wonder if you could just opening and closing a parenthesis about how, I mean, this is the story that I never get tired of reading or listening about how Frederick Douglass educated himself and how he taught himself to read and how he became such an eloquent speaker.
He was a natural. Okay, I think you would have to be imagining things if you didn't recognize it. This was a blessing from the secular gods that this person came on the scene. When he was a little boy, he was a companion for the white boy in his owner's family, and the mother was teaching her son how to read. And while she taught her son to read, since she was not accustomed to owning slaves, she taught Frederick as his letters as well. And her husband walked in and said, "What are you doing? Don't you know a slave who learns how to read is a slave who will run away?" And Douglass heard it and thought that was a terrific idea. So he continued to teach himself after his mistress stopped teaching him how to read. And he did it many ways. He would take bread from their household and offer it to the poor white boys on the docks where he could wander in Baltimore. And in exchange for the bread, they would teach him the bread of knowledge, how to read. He would look at the signs at the docks and figure out what they must mean. And then he would reverse engineer them and figure out what the symbolism of the letters must be, since that's what they must say. I mean, this was an extraordinary human being. He also played the violin. I mean, he was really something else. And there are many smart people, and there are many people who are good with the written word, but he was that rare Avis who was also good with the spoken word. He was charismatic and he was melodramatic, and he was a fantastic rhetorician and speaker as well as a writer. And his letters are amazing. You know, the issues of the North Star, his paper, are just beautiful to read. So the word in the beginning was the word, where Frederick Douglass is concerned.
Do you have time for one more question?
One more question.
Okay, so it's my understanding that there was some friction between the Boston Abolition Party and the New York Abolition Party. Can you explain? I mean, wasn't the end goal the same, to end slavery? Why was there any friction about between those two parties?
So William Lloyd Garrison was, as many of those early adopters are, somebody who only listened to his own voice. Okay, and it may be that it's necessary to be like that, to be somebody who says we have to end slavery immediately when all the other white people in America were either enslavers or complicit. So he was like very inner directed. And he decided that the Constitution, which is probably right accurately, was a slave document, a bargain with the devil, and that abolition could not participate in politics because every time they ventured into politics, they would meet the Constitution. The Constitution would say, you can't do this. The Constitution protects slavery. So he decided that the only way to fight slavery was for the North to secede from the Union, to disavow its complicity in the slave nation. There is the small fact that this would leave several million Black people in slavery in the slave empire. So I don't exactly know how he thought it was going to come out. He thought that if the North stopped supporting it and they weren't part of this giant economy and stuff, that it would suffer greatly. I don't know how true that is. They were very wedded to their diseconomic system. But he believed that you could only make a moral argument against slavery and you had to be prepared to secede from the Union. The New York branch had a bunch of very creative lawyers in it, and they figured out arguments for how the Constitution doesn't actually say slavery anywhere, and therefore it could be read as not protecting slavery. And if the Constitution doesn't lock you out, you can engage in politics. And, you know, it's America. It's a self-governing country. You could change people's minds about the political things they wanted to do. They would then elect abolitionists to Congress. They would pass laws that made it harder and harder for slavery. And eventually you would abolish it, first in the territories. And then ultimately their arguments are even in the slave empire, but that's very late. Garrison wanted nothing to do with politics.
Right.
So there was, as there often is with those visionary, very ideological, rigid leaders, a breach.
Well, Linda, I read the review that was published about your book in the New York Times. I wonder if you could tell the listeners what would they have to type whenever they do a search in the New York Times in order to read that review. And then can you tell us one last time the title of the book and where can the listeners follow the work that you're doing?
So they can Google The Color of Abolition, and the review by the world's most wonderful human being will appear. Right? That review was the writer's dream. And it meant all the more to me because he is a very important scholar in my exact period. And his book won a very big prize and is about something that's very close to what I was writing about. So his high opinion meant the world to me, as you can imagine. So just type Color of Abolition into Google, and it will turn up the review in the New York Times, which will be in the print edition on Sunday.
And okay.
And they want to look at the things I've written about the gay revolution and about Ruth Bader Ginsburg and Sandra Day O'Connor and the other stuff, then they can just go to, the book independent booksellers website or to Amazon and type in Linda Hirshman, Hirshman. There is no C in Hirshman. And that will turn up much lefty political analysis.
Linda, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you for your patience.